salary, salarium. The thing a Roman legionnaire in 78 of the Common Era carried back to his tent at the end of a 16-mile march. The thing a software engineer in San Francisco receives by direct deposit every other Friday. Same word, same function, 2,000 years between them, and almost nothing has changed except the medium. The word arrives in modern English through Old French, salary, through Anglo-Norman, through medieval Latin, and finally back to its origin, the language of a state that paid its soldiers, in part, in salt. Not metaphorically, not poetically, in actual salt. The kind that was scraped off the inside of a wooden barrel and weighed out by hand onto a small flat tray and tipped into a leather pouch that smelled of sweat and oil. The word today means a fixed annual amount paid out in installments. Roughly $2 trillion in salary changes hands every year worldwide. In the United States, the median household earns about $80,000 before tax. In Germany, the average gross is around 4,000 euros per month. In Japan, 440,000 yen. In Poland, 8,000 zloty. The currencies differ. The mechanism does not. A fixed sum at fixed intervals against documented service. It pays mortgages. It pays for child care. It pays for the dental work nobody talks about and the therapy nobody admits to. It is the structure that turns a life into a number, and it does so quietly, automatically, 26 times a year in 83 currencies on every continent except Antarctica. The popular story says Roman soldiers were paid in salt. This is the version that gets repeated in textbooks, in dictionaries, in the etymology pages of newspaper Sunday supplements. It is partly true. The fuller version is more interesting and harder to remember, which is why it is rarely told. The salarium was a specific allowance tied to salt, sometimes paid in salt, often paid in coin calculated at the going price of salt, sometimes paid in mixed form. What survived into modern languages is not the salt itself, but the bookkeeping category. The line in a ledger that said, "This much for sustaining the man." That category outlived the empire, the language, the army, and the salt. And it is the line still active in every payroll system on the planet. Step back 1 century. January 5th, 1914. Henry Ford announces a $5 workday at the River Rouge plant in Highland Park, Michigan. The previous standard at Ford had been $2.34 per 9-hour day. The $5 figure was not generosity. It was retention. Turnover at the plant had reached 370% annually. Workers were quitting faster than they could be trained. The $5 day cut turnover, cut training costs, and, quietly, turned Ford workers into Ford customers. The Model T sold for around $450 at that point. A worker on $5 a day could buy one in about 3 months of saving. The fixed industrial wage, paid weekly, deductible at source, predictable enough to plan a household around, this is when it begins. The salary, in the modern sense, is barely 110 years old in this form. Add another piece. June 9th, 1943. The current Tax Payment Act passes the United States Congress. Until that date, Americans paid income tax in a lump sum the following spring, the way they paid property tax, the way they paid customs duties. After that date, the tax came out of the paycheck before the paycheck reached the worker's hand. Pay as you earn. Withholding. The employer became, in effect, a tax collector for the state, exactly as the Roman procurator had been a paymaster for the emperor. The bookkeeping category, money owed to the state, automatically deducted, never seen, is the modern direct descendant of the deductions that came off a legionnaire's 225 denarii before he ever opened the pouch. 18 and a half centuries between them. The mechanism is identical. Step back further. 14th century. A clerk in the wool trade of Bruges is paid in Flemish florins. A scribe in the Vatican receives a stipend from the papal treasury. The English word wages is already in the language by this point, borrowed from Old French gage, a pledge, a deposit, what you put down to seal an agreement. Pay in this period is irregular, often in kind. Grain, cloth, salt fish, the right to graze sheep on common land. A medieval English peasant might receive sixpence at Michaelmas, 2 loaves a week at the manor kitchen, and the use of 1 acre on the south slope. That was his salary, though he would not have used the word. The Liber Albus, the great white book of the city of London, compiled in 1419 by John Carpenter, records the wages of the city's craftsmen in extraordinary detail. A master mason, 6 pence a day. A carpenter, 5 pence halfpenny. A tiler, 4 pence. A laborer who carried mortar, 2 pence halfpenny. Each entry includes the Latin term for the payment, salarium, stipendium, or pentio, depending on whether the payment was tied to a service, a position, or a periodic arrangement. The word salarium is already, in 1419, several hundred years removed from any actual salt, but it is still the word the clerks reach for when they want to record what a man is owed for his labor. The word we are about to say used to mean something else. Salary, in English, came through medieval Latin salarium, and the root of salarium is not fixed payment. The root is sal, salt, sal, 3 letters, the Latin word for salt. The same word with minor shifts in nearly every Indo-European language touched by Latin or Greek. Salarium in Republic-era Rome was the word for the allowance given to a Roman soldier for the purchase of, or as a direct ration of, salt. Salt was not seasoning in the 1st century. Salt was a strategic resource. It preserved meat for a marching army. It cured fish. It tanned leather. It tempered iron. It was used in concrete. It was given to slaves as part of their daily ration. The Latin idiom, non est dignus sal, he isn't worth his salt, is older than the empire, and it meant exactly what it still means today. Pliny the Elder writes in the Natural History, Book 31, Chapter 41, in Rome, the soldier's pay was originally salt, and the word salary derives from it. That sentence was published in 77 of the Common Era, 1 year before the scene we are about to enter. Pliny is not theorizing about a dead practice. He is describing something his readers would have recognized from the army payrolls they themselves dealt with, or from the men in their own families who had served. Pliny himself had served as a cavalry officer in Germania in the late 40s. He had seen the procedure from the inside. Vibius, writing the De Re Militari roughly 300 years later, around the year 390, devotes a passage of Book 2 to military pay. He records that the soldier's pay was distributed 3 times a year, at Saturnalia in December, at the spring military feast, and at midsummer, that the deductions were made openly, and that the residue was deposited in the unit's regimental savings under the standards. Half of every donative, every bonus paid by an emperor, was withheld and added to that savings account. The soldier could not access it until discharge. By the late empire, it functioned like a pension fund. The aerarium militare, the military treasury established by Augustus in the year 6 of the Common Era, was its central institution. The first state-managed pension fund in European history is older than the New Testament. Tacitus describes what happens when the pay system fails. In the Annals, Book 1, chapters 16 through 30, he records the mutinies of the Pannonian and Germanic legions immediately after the death of Augustus in 14 of the Common Era. The grievance is concrete. The soldiers want their pay raised from 10 asses a day, about 2.5 sestertia, to a denarius. They want their term of service shortened from 20 years to 16. They want their bonus on discharge paid in cash, not in plots of marshy land in Pannonia, which they would not survive long enough to till. They send a centurion named Julius Clemens with a list to negotiate. Tiberius's son Drusus meets them in Pannonia. The mutiny lasts weeks. Men are killed. Eventually, the demands are partially met. The empire learned a lesson. Do not delay the salary, and do not pretend that the salt is enough. Here is the longer mechanic. Under the Republic, Roman soldiers were originally not paid at all in the modern sense. The early legions were composed of property-holding citizens who served at their own expense, with the right to spoils on campaign. The state provided the salt, and not much else. In 107 before the Common Era, the consul Gaius Marius opened the legions to landless citizens, the capitae censi, and the state had to begin paying them because they had nothing of their own to bring. The Marian reforms transformed the army from a citizen militia to a standing professional force, and they transformed the salarium from a small supplemental ration into a real category of state expenditure. 49 before the Common Era. Julius Caesar, in his second consulship, doubles the standard legionary pay from 5 asses a day to 10, from 112.5 denarii a year to 225. The figure of 225 denarii becomes the baseline that survives, with adjustments, until Domitian raises it to 300 at the end of the 1st century. The number Marcus Vibius received in 78 CE is the number Caesar set in 49 BCE. 127 years between them, and the rate had not moved. Augustus, in the year 6 of the Common Era, establishes the aerarium militare, the military treasury. Funded by a 5% inheritance tax on Roman citizens and a 1% sales tax, the treasury exists to pay discharge bonuses and pensions to veterans. The bonus was 3,000 denarii on completion 20 years' service, roughly 13 years of base pay accumulated in one lump payment, or, after Augustus's reforms, a parcel of land of equivalent value in a frontier colony. The Roman state, in the year 6 of the Common Era, had invented retirement. Here is the full mechanic on a single legionnaire, under Vespasian in the 7th decade of the Common Era. A foot soldier receives a base pay of 225 denarii per year, paid in 3 installments. From the gross are deducted the cost of his weapons and replacement gear, the cost of his uniform, the cost of his daily food ration, the cost of his bedding, a contribution toward the unit's burial fund, and a mandatory contribution toward his own discharge savings. The salarium, the salt allowance, was either added on top of the gross or counted within the food deduction, depending on the legion and the decade. The exact accounting varied by procurator and by century. What did not vary was the principle. Part of what you earned was the right to eat. The rest was the residue. This is where we have direct documentation. The Vindolanda tablets, discovered in 1973 at a Roman fort in northern Britain near Hadrian's Wall, contain hundreds of wooden writing tablets from the years roughly 85 to 130 of the Common Era. Among them are actual surviving pay records. One tablet, catalogued as Tab Vindal 2178, records the dispersal of payments to soldiers of the first cohort of Tungrians. The deductions are itemized. The residue is signed for. The handwriting is that of a regimental clerk 1,800 years dead, in cursive Latin, on a sliver of birch bark thinner than a fingernail. The procedure documented on that tablet is the procedure the procurator's office in Tarraco would have used in 78. The bookkeeping has the same columns as a modern payslip: gross, deductions, net. Stop the clock for a moment. Marcus Vibius, 26 years old, soldier of the 7th Gemina Legion, walks the last quarter mile of a 16-mile march. Northern Hispania, late summer, 78 of the Common Era. His tunic is gray with road dust. His sandals are wet from a stream crossing 2 hours back. His shoulder aches where the strap of his pack is worn through 3 layers of wool and into the skin. The smell of the camp reaches him before he sees it. Wood smoke, oil, horse, the iron tang of the field forge, the rancid edge of week-old salted pork. At the gate, 2 soldiers of his own century nod at him without speaking. He turns left along the Via Principalis. At a low wooden table outside the Praetorium, a clerk in a leather apron weighs out a portion of coarse rock salt onto a wooden tray. Marcus opens a small drawstring pouch. The salt goes in. Then 4 silver denarii, light, cold to the touch, stamped with the profile of Vespasian. Marcus signs nothing. The clerk marks a tally in wax with a bronze stylus. Marcus closes the pouch, walks to his tent, sits in the edge of his cot, and unstraps his sandals. He has been paid. That was the moment the word entered the European language, not in a treatise, not in a speech in the Senate. In a tally in wax on a wooden writing board at the gate of a marching camp in Hispania Tarraconensis, by a clerk whose name is not recorded, on an afternoon nobody bothered to date. The number nobody bothered to record at the time is worth recording now. By Pliny's calculation, a legion of 5,000 men consumed approximately 130 kilograms of salt per day. Over a year, 50,000 kilograms. The empire fielded 28 legions in the year 78. The total annual salt consumption of the Roman army alone, for ration, for preservation, for trade, exceeded 1.5 million kilograms. The Roman state ran an apparatus, quarries, salt pans on the coast at Ostia and Servia, harbor magazines, caravans, ledgers, accountants, for the sole purpose of putting roughly 22 grams of salt on each soldier's tray every evening, and a corresponding portion into his pouch on payday. Without salt, the meat the army carried spoiled within 3 days. With salt, the same meat lasted 3 months. With heavy curing and smoke, 6 months. The legions could not have crossed Gaul. They could not have garrisoned the Rhine. They could not have held Dacia or Britain or the Euphrates frontier. The army that ate moved. The army that did not, did not. The salarium was not generosity. It was logistics. It was the difference between a state that existed and a state that did not. This part is off the record. The salarium was paid in actual salt, only some of the time, and only in some legions, and only in some decades. By the late Republic, much of it was already converted to coin, denarii, calculated at the going rate of salt in the local market. The soldier paid in salt is the literal version of a system that, even by the 1st century, was moving steadily toward abstraction. The word stayed, the salt mostly left. The state kept the convenience of saying the soldier had been paid for his food, and the soldier kept the convenience of having something fungible in his pouch. Both sides of the transaction had reasons to preserve the language even after the substance was gone. That preservation is what carried the word into French, into English, into modern banking software, and into every contract of employment signed anywhere on the planet last Friday. The salt pans themselves were industrial. At Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, hundreds of shallow, rectangular evaporation ponds covered the coastal lagoon. Seawater was admitted at high tide, sealed off, and allowed to evaporate under the Mediterranean sun. After 4 to 6 weeks, the crust of salt was raked, dried, and shipped upriver to the city granaries, and from there to the legions. The Roman state initially leased the salt pans to private contractors, the publicani, who paid a fee and took the profit. But by the late Republic, the salt monopoly had been absorbed directly by the state. There was a tax, the vectigal, on commercial salt. There was a magistrate, the salinator, who oversaw the works. The Roman family name Salinator entered Roman history through Marcus Livius Salinator, who fought Hannibal at the Metaurus in 207 before the Common Era, and earned his cognomen from an ancestor who had administered the salt tax. A man could become consul on the strength of a name that meant the salt master. Sal. The Indo-European root reaches deeper than Latin. The reconstructed proto-form, Sal, gives Greek hals, salt and sea both, the same word. It gives Welsh halen. It gives German salts, Dutch zout, Swedish salt. It gives Old Slavic soli, modern Russian and Polish and Czech sol. It gives Sanskrit sara, salty. It gives Lithuanian saldus, sweet, the same root, the perception of taste-saturated foods having drifted between the two opposite poles of the human palate. Out of that root come, in Latin alone, sal, salt, salarium, pay, salinator, saltmaster, salir, to leap, salacious, lustful, salad, salata, salted things. The Romans put salt on raw vegetables. The Greeks called such a dish hals. A salad is, etymologically, a wage. The thing on the plate is the same word as the thing in the pouch. The same root gives modern English sauce, salsas, salted, and sausage, from salsiccia, salted meat, and salami, salame, the cured salted Italian sausage, and salsa, the Spanish version. Every cured meat in every European language is a relative of the word printed on the payslip. The Via Salaria itself ran from Castrum Truentinum on the Adriatic coast across the Apennines to the Forum Romanum. It carried salt from the eastern coastal pans inland to the legions, the senate, the bakers, the butchers, the temple keepers, the embalmers. The road existed because the salt had to move. It was older than the Republic, older than the Etruscan kings. It is mentioned in the legendary accounts of the Sabines, who controlled the salt trade in the early days of the sea. There is no founding date for the Via Salaria, because the road predates the records that would have given it one. The Romans did not build it. The Romans inherited it, paved it, garrisoned it, and made it the spine of a logistical empire. 78 of the Common Era. The year Marcus Vibius walks into his tent in Hispania. Vespasian sits in Rome, 3 years from his death, building the Flavian dynasty on the rubble of the civil wars that followed Nero. The new Colosseum is under construction. The Jewish war has ended 7 years earlier. Pompeii is functioning normally, with no idea that it has 1 year left to live. A clerk in the procuratorial office in Tarraco files a tally sheet that records the salarium distributed in the 3rd quarter to the 7th Legion. The sheet does not survive. The word that named the distribution does. The Legio VII Gemina itself has a specific history. It was raised by Galba in the summer of 68, when Galba was still the governor of Hispania and was preparing to march on Nero. Originally numbered the 7th Hispania, Galba took it to Rome to support his bid for the throne. After Galba's assassination, it served briefly under Otho, and then Vitellius, and then Vespasian. Vespasian transferred it to Pannonia, then back to Hispania in 74, where it was merged with another unit and given the new title Gemina, twin, to mark the merger. By 78, it was the standing garrison of the Iberian Peninsula, based at the fortress of Legio, modern Lyon. Marcus Vibius's pouch came from that procurator's office in Tarraco on the coast, and traveled north with a clerk under armed escort to be distributed at the camp. Named 8 men of the 7th Gemina Legion, attested by inscription or by surviving bronze military diploma from this period. Lucius Albinius, Gaius Valerius, Marcus Vibius, Titus Flavius Capito, Quintus Rufius, Publius Aelius Maximus, Tiberius Claudius Pollio, Gnaeus Cornelius Verus. Each of them received the same salarium. Each carried the same kind of pouch, back to the same kind of tent. Each ate the same preserved pork, salted on the coast of Hispania Tarraconensis, or imported from the pans at Ostia, and signed off by mark, by tally, by absence of complaint, on the same transaction. 225 denarii, minus deductions plus a measured weight of salt, per year, for 25 years, if they survived. At which point they were discharged with a parcel of land in a frontier colony, or a final cash bonus drawn on the aerarium militari, and the word veteranus entered the record where miles had been before. Some of them retired in Hispania and bought olive groves. Some of them retired and drank. Some of them did not retire because they did not survive. The military diplomas that cord their names, folding bronze tablets, one half kept by the soldier and one half archived in the capital, were issued at discharge as proof of citizenship and pension rights. Several thousand survive. They are the receipts on which the entire modern concept of state-managed retirement rests. 78 of the Common Era. The formula stabilizes here. Not invented. It had existed in some form since the early Republic, refined by Marius, doubled by Caesar, structured by Augustus, codified by Tiberius and the procuratorial bureaucracy, but standardized. After this point, a legionnaire's pay is documented in census records, in military diplomas, in inscriptions on tombstones from Britain to the Euphrates, in the Vindolanda tablets, in the Egyptian papyrus archives of the eastern provinces. The word salarium is used without explanation. Everyone reading it knows what it means. By the 4th century, when Vegetius writes, the procedure has remained essentially unchanged for 300 years. By the time the Western Empire collapses in the late 5th century, the word is so embedded in Latin bureaucratic vocabulary that the Visigothic and Frankish kingdoms inherit it intact. Etymology is a document that cannot be burned. Empires fall, languages drift. Coins are melted down for the silver content. Roads crumble. Forts are buried under wheat fields. Marching camps become parish churches. Procuratorial offices become bishops' palaces. But a word, once it has entered the bloodstream of a continent, keeps walking. Through the Visigoths, through the Merovingians, through Charlemagne and the Carolingian capitulary system that adapted Roman administrative Latin to a new feudal economy, through the chanceries of medieval France, through the Norman conquest of England in 1066, when Anglo-Norman scribes brought the word salarii into a country that had previously used the Old English wage and stipend, through the wool clerks of Bruges in the 14th century, through the priests of medieval France, through John Carpenter in the Liber Albus of London in 1419, through the rise of the joint stock company in the 16th century, through the British East India Company, where a clerk's salary was first formally distinguished from his commission, through the Industrial Revolution, through Henry Ford, through the payroll software on the laptop of someone who has never tasted unrefined sea salt in their life. Today, the same thing, mechanically. The terms have changed, the medium has changed, but the formula has not. The modern paycheck is a salarium with the salt removed and the silver replaced by a number on a screen. An employee receives a fixed sum at fixed intervals. From it are deducted income tax for the state, a direct descendant of the Roman tributum, contribution to the pension fund, which is the modern equivalent of the veteranus land grant, funded out of the aerarium militari, health insurance, which is the modern equivalent of the army surgeon, and the regimental burial fund. Sometimes union dues, the way a Roman soldier paid into his unit's collegia, and the cost of the tools required to do the job, the modern equivalent of the deduction for weapons and uniform. What remains is denominated in currency, but the currency itself is a unit of state-guaranteed value, exactly as the denarius was state-guaranteed silver under the emperor's profile, exactly as the wooden tally was state-guaranteed entitlement under the procurator's mark. The legion clerk in Hispania kept a tally in wax with a bronze stylus. The HR department in Munich keeps a tally in SAP. The function is identical. The state, or its institutional surrogate, certifies that a person who has performed a defined service is entitled to a defined draw on collective resources, and the certification is the salary, regardless of whether what is drawn is salt, silver, denarii, or a number on a banking app accessed from a phone in a kitchen at 7 in the morning while coffee is being made. The salt is still there, technically. It is in the chain of basic goods the modern worker must purchase to remain alive. Food, shelter, water, electricity, heating, internet, which has become as functional a utility as water was in 78 CE. The portion of the salary that goes to those things, roughly 30 to 50% in most developed economies, higher in expensive cities, higher still for younger workers paying down student debt, is the modern modicum salus, the measured ration, the part that keeps you marching. The portion that goes to surplus, to choice, to leisure, is what was rare in 78 CE and is rare again now. Statistics from the United States Bureau of Labor show that the median worker spends about 34% of gross income on housing alone. Marcus Vibius spent roughly the same proportion of his salarium on food and gear. The arithmetic, 18 and a half centuries later, is dimensionally identical. Marcus Vibius did not know he was being paid for the empire's logistics. He knew he was being paid for his service. He knew the salt was for his food. He did not know that the word for what he received would outlive every coin, every road, every wall of every fort he ever slept inside. He did not know that an emperor who would not be born for another 2,000 years would sign tax legislation that mirrored, line by line, the deductions on the clerk's wax tablet. The software engineer in San Francisco does not know she is being paid for the platform's logistics. She knows she is being paid for her service. She knows the deposit covers her rent. She does not know that the word for what she receives walked into the language in a marching camp in Hispania Tarraconensis in late summer in the 78th year of the Common Era. She does not know that the bookkeeping category called withholding on her payslip is descended by a chain of unbroken bureaucratic inheritance from the deduction for ration salt taken off Marcus Vibius's 225 denarii by a clerk in Tarraco. The chain is unbroken because no one has ever had a reason to break it. Each generation simply renamed the categories and kept the structure. At the end of the march, Marcus Vibius opens a small drawstring pouch. Inside, a measured weight of salt, 4 silver denarii, and a word that will travel through Latin into French, into English, into 73 modern languages spoken on this planet. 16 days after that march, a clerk in the procuratorial office in Tarraco files a sheet that does not survive. 40 years after that, Marcus Vibius, if he survives, receives his bronze diploma at discharge, walks out of the Legion with a parcel of land near Asturica Augusta, and dies on it, probably in his 50s, of something that today would be cured by a single prescription. 2,000 years after his march, the same word arrives in someone's bank account on a Friday afternoon in a city built on land that was forest the year Marcus Vibius died. The pouch is gone. The salt is gone. The clerk's wax tablet is dust under a parking lot in Tarragona, 2 streets from the cathedral. The procurator's office is a tapas bar, but on the deposit notification, in small letters, just above the figure that determines whether rent gets paid this month, the word is still there. Salary, salarium, salt money. Nothing has changed except the medium. And the medium is what we always notice last.